Hey everyone, in today's episode, I'm going to finish my reply to Skydivephil's documentary on the kalam argument. In part one, which you can check out in the link below, I talked about the documentary's critique of philosophical arguments that are offered for the beginning of the universe. So, like the impossibility of an infinite past. In this part, I'm going to focus on where the documentary talks about the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe, and also principles and arguments that are related to the first premise in the kalam argument, or that whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. So let's take a look.
What about cosmology? Doesn't the Big Bang imply the universe had a beginning? The Penrose-Hawking singularity theorems that supposedly proved this have assumptions that almost nobody in cosmology takes seriously anymore. In particular, most physicists think Einstein's theory of gravity will need to be modified to take into account quantum or other effects that arise in the extreme conditions of the Big Bang. This isn't just the consensus of cosmologists, but the views of the very authors of the singularity theorems, Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking.
The real lesson of the singularity theorems is therefore that we need to combine the general theory of relativity with quantum theory in order to understand the origin of the universe.
It is certainly a view quite commonly expressed now that we shouldn't simply give up that the Big Bang is a singularity, that we need a theory which describes that. Most people would say it's a form of quantum gravity. I have a view which is different from that, but nevertheless, I have in common with that we need a new theory.
I don't think anybody believes that the universe started off with the singularity. That just tells us that Einstein's classical theory of general relativity breaks down. So their classical theory of gravity doesn't apply when you get to very high energies. So it's replaced by some quantum theory, consistent quantum theory of gravity. String theory is a candidate.
Standard Big Bang cosmology, which was a hot Big Bang, right? You start with a very hot, dense universe, and which begins at singularity. So that picture, I don't think anybody believes.
This is why I cited Siegel's article, "There Was No Big Bang Singularity," in part one of my review. It's important to not overstate the presence of a singularity in the models of the origin of the universe. In fact, William Lane Craig is aware of these exceptions to the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems, and is also of the need to have a theory that unites quantum physics and general relativity in a single explanation of the origin of the universe. Craig writes, "The standard Big Bang model needs to be modified in various ways. For example, the model is based on Einstein's general theory of relativity, but Einstein's theory breaks down when space is shrunk down to subatomic proportions. We'll need to introduce quantum physics at that point, and no one is sure how this is to be done." In their 2009 article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, William Lane Craig and James Sinclair review a variety of proposals that provide a model for the origin of the universe that has an exception to the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems. And they claim that these models either don't prove the universe is eternal, or they even point towards an absolute beginning of time. So in the next part of the documentary, the hosts interview different physicists who take issue with Craig's claims about modern cosmology proving the universe had a beginning. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this section because I've come to the position that this evidence from physics, it should not be our primary evidence that the universe had a beginning. And this is something I've thought about for a while. I wrote this in my first book, Answering Atheism, that was published back in 2013. This is what I wrote about the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. I wrote, "A critic could object that all appeal to scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe can never be conclusive. He might say that science is a tentative enterprise, and that theories are easily overturned by the next scientific breakthrough. Now, we should be open to where the evidence leads, and not engage in brash overconfidence. At the same time, I think it's fair to note that the history of cosmology describes how more and more evidence has been added to confirm the Big Bang model. However, the tentative nature of science is why I consider the philosophical argument for the finite past to be the main part of the kalam cosmological argument. The scientific evidence simply serves as a confirmation of the conclusion reached in the philosophical arguments. It's the scientific icing on the philosophical cake." End quote. Nowadays, I'd probably phrase it this way. The evidence from physics provides models that allow for a finite past and models that allow for an infinite past. So this means the findings of modern cosmology are consistent with a finite past, even if they don't conclusively prove the past is finite. And this part of the documentary backs up what I'm saying because it only seeks to defend the possibility of cosmological models that allow for an eternal universe. It doesn't disprove models that include a past finite universe. At one point, they even say this.
Just as there are theorems that prove the universe had a beginning, there are also theorems that imply the opposite.
I think you can prove anything. Theorems are very strange things because you can have a theorem to prove anything as long as you assume the right things. In a way, that's a problem.
Another point I want to bring up is the discussion they have about the pre-Big Bang scenario that's described in the documentary. So there are popular magazines that will talk about these models as if they disprove the beginning of the universe or the past being finite. But the authors of these models are much more cautious about their findings and their conclusions. Physicists Gabriele Veneziano and Maurizio Gasparini write the following. The so-called pre-Big Bang scenario described in this report has to be seen in the above perspective as a possible example, even just as a toy model, of what cosmology can look like if we assume that the sought-for standard model of gravity and cosmology is based on some particular version of superstring theory. It is a priori far from obvious that the state-of-the-art in this field can provide an unambiguous answer to this question. In his book, Reasonable Faith, William Lane Craig points out one problem with the pre-Big Bang model in trying to use it to show that the universe is eternal. He writes, "The pre-Big Bang scenario postulates an eternal, static space in which our observable universe originates via a Big Bang event a finite time ago. But since there is a positive probability of a black hole's forming in any patch of pre-existing space, such an event, given infinite past time, would have happened infinitely long ago, which is inconsistent with the finite age of our observable universe. What they have done, in effect, is to treat the past as a potentially infinite process approaching an infinitely distant limit, rather than as an actually infinite sequence of events, having no beginning, but an end in the present." My point in bringing this up is to let people know that Craig is aware of these other models, as can be seen in the relevant chapters in his book Reasonable Faith and his essay in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And that essay also includes personal correspondence with the physicists and other authors, including some that are featured in this documentary. You can also see replies like these in Craig's debates and public lectures. Let me share a few of them. First, there's the issue of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. I'll let the documentary summarize it and then show Craig's response to that in a debate with Peter Millikan.
Physics community abandoning its belief in the applicability of the Penrose-Hawking theorem, Kalam advocates switched to a newer theorem known as the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or BGV. This theorem was developed because the period of rapid expansion, known as inflation, that's believed to have taken place in the early universe, violates one of the assumptions of the Penrose-Hawking theorem, that gravity is always attractive. Inflation is also thought to be eternal into the future, creating an infinite multiverse.
In 2003, Arvin Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the very early universe. So in fact, the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem does imply an absolute beginning of the universe.
I was working with Arvind Borda and Alex Valenkin to understand what we can learn about how inflation might have started and how far back it could have gone. And in particular, once we realized that inflation could be eternal into the future, it seemed like a very natural question to ask, could inflation have also been eternal into the past? And what we found was that inflation could not be eternal into the past. What we basically managed to achieve was proving a theorem which says that any expanding region of space-time that has some minimum expansion rate can only go back so far and not infinitely far. So that means that inflation must have had a beginning. It doesn't really say that the universe must have had a beginning, but it says that the universe could not have been expanding forever up until the present time.
And I argued first that the universe began to exist. And here he says, well, but look, there are different multiverse scenarios, various models of the universe. I talked about those in my opening speech and explained that the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies to those and shows a beginning of the universe. And then he says, but Vilenkin says that you can avoid the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem by positing a contraction prior to this one. Now, this is a statement from a letter of Vilenkin to Victor Stenger, which is very often quoted out of context by atheists. Let me read you the full context. Vilenkin says, you can evade the theorem by postulating that the universe was contracting prior to some time. This sounds as if there is nothing wrong with having a contraction prior to expansion. But the problem is that a contracting universe is highly unstable. Small perturbations would cause it to develop all sorts of messy singularities, so it would never make it to the expanding phase. So he says, if someone asks me whether or not the theorem I proved with Born-Guth implies that the universe had a beginning, I would say that the short answer is yes. If you are willing to get into subtleties, then the answer is no, but. That is to say, you've got the problem with the messy singularities that prevent re-expansion.
I do want to add here that, to the documentary's credit, they do offer a reply to this objection from Craig, though it's a somewhat speculative reply about this aspect of cosmology and astrophysics. And then Craig, of course, has other things to say about that kind of reply in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. So these replies that Craig makes, they're interesting, and they should be judged on their own merits. But as I said, I now think we should see scientific evidence for the beginning of the past. This is something that is consistent with the kalam argument, but isn't one of the major pieces of evidence for it. I would say that cosmology, since the time of the Catholic priest Georges Lemaitre, the guy who discovered the Big Bang, though he didn't call it that, it hasn't given us proof of an ultimate beginning. But it does provide an intriguing sort of signpost in that direction. However, the last part of the documentary, I would say, is relevant to the question of whether the kalam argument succeeds, because this last part of the documentary goes after premise one of the kalam argument, or the claim that whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. If this premise is refuted, then you could concede, yeah, the universe began in the finite past, but it didn't have any cause, let alone a divine one. So let's take a look at some of the arguments that are presented.
What if the universe did have a beginning? In the 1970s, Edward Tryon claimed the universe might arise as a quantum fluctuation of the vacuum. But this still raises the question, where did the vacuum come from? In 1982, Alex Valenkin suggested that if space itself was treated quantum mechanically, it could quantum tunnel into existence. He titled his proposal, Creation of Universes from Nothing.
Now, sometimes skeptics will respond to this point by saying that in physics, subatomic particles, so-called virtual particles, come into being from nothing. This skeptical response represents, I believe, a deliberate abuse of science. The theories in question have to do with particles or the universes originating as a fluctuation of the energy contained in the vacuum. The vacuum in modern physics is not what laymen understand by vacuum, namely nothing. Rather, in physics, The vacuum is a sea of fluctuating energy governed by physical laws and having a physical structure. To tell laymen that on such theories something comes from nothing is a distortion of those theories. Properly understood, nothing does not mean just empty space. Nothing is the absence of anything whatsoever, even space itself. How silly then when popularizers say things like nothingness is unstable to quantum fluctuations, or the universe tunneled into being out of nothing.
When we say nothing in this context, tunneling from nothing, we don't mean quantum vacuum. It's actually what Ed Trent meant. And here we have a state without space completely. So there is no vacuum.
But if the universe did quantum tunnel into existence, what caused it?
Many quantum mechanical processes do not require a cause. So for example, if you have a radioactive atom, you know that it will decay, but you cannot tell when. There is a half-life time. For example, you can tell that in a year, the probability for this atom to decay is 50%. Then the year has passed, it didn't decay. The probability for it to decay the next year is still 50%. Eventually, it will decay. But if you ask why did it decay at that particular moment, there is no reason. There is no cause. So quantum mechanical processes like this are uncaused. And the spontaneous creation of the universe is of the same nature.
First, Vilenkin's cosmological model of the universe tunneling from nothing, it's not the same as something coming from absolute nothing. And this is a point that Vilenkin himself admits in his 2008 book, Many Worlds in One. He writes that, quote, "The state of nothing cannot be identified with absolute nothingness." In a personal communication to Craig and his co-author James Sinclair, Vilenkin wrote, "I understand that a universe of zero radius is not necessarily the same thing as no universe at all." So proving that random events can happen in realms that are described by the laws of quantum mechanics, that doesn't do anything to show that something could come from a state of absolute nothingness or from absolute nothing. It also doesn't refute our general beliefs in causality, such as the idea that whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Or to put it another way, things do not begin to exist with no cause at all. Second, the randomness of quantum mechanics does not disprove the idea that something cannot come from nothing, or that whatever begins to exist has a cause. I mean, if you think about it, scientists can reliably replicate or duplicate experiments they use to prove quantum mechanics, things like the so-called double slit experiment. They can replicate it repeatedly in a lab. This shows there's still order and causation in the quantum realm, even if it's not classically determined. It's true there's a debate about the randomness of things like virtual particles appearing in quantum vacuums. There's even a debate about whether those virtual particles are real or they're just like fictional bookkeeping devices in the equations of physics. But regardless, what they don't disprove is the impossibility of something coming from nothing. The physicist David Albert writes this: "The fact that particles can pop in and out of existence over time, as those quantum fields rearrange themselves, is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that fists can pop in and out of existence over time as my fingers rearrange themselves. And none of these poppings, if you look at them aright, amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing." The atheistic philosopher Graham Oppy writes this: "Quantum cases provide no support for the claim that there are things that pop into existence without any prior cause."
The notions of quantum mechanics place severe pressure on our everyday ideas of causality. You might say, well, there are some interpretations of quantum mechanics that allow for causality and determinism, and it's true, there are, but then there are other interpretations that don't.
Since the kalam asserts that everything that begins to exist has a cause, its defenders carry the burden of proof to show causality is maintained in quantum mechanics.
No, a person who wants to undercut or rebut the basic intuition that whatever begins to exist has a cause has the burden of proof to show that what happens in quantum mechanics refutes these principles. Merely showing how other kinds of causes exist, like probabilistic causation, that doesn't, reliably predict an effect every single time, that doesn't disprove the principle. Like, I believe, for example, there's agent causation. That's totally unpredictable. Because I could say a random word like jorbil, and the laws of physics can't predict when I'm going to verbally utter a word like jorbil. It's random, it's agent causation, but it still has a cause. So let's take a look at the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and then I'll offer some other thoughts on them.
The different interpretations of quantum mechanics do differ a lot in terms of the role of causality. Start with the Bohm interpretation, or Bohmian mechanics, or the pilot wave theory. That is the most like classical mechanics when it comes to causality. Causality is deterministic, and cause necessarily follows effect according to the law. A bit of a more of a deviation from the classical approach to causality comes in collapse theories, dynamical collapse theories, or the GRW approach. And these theories have irreducible randomness in the way the world turns out. So an effect need not necessarily follow a cause. A given cause could lead to many effects with different probabilities of each one. And there would be nothing in the world that explains why one effect happens rather than another.
In the Copenhagen interpretation, things are acausal simply because it's kind of built in the nature of interpretation. You have a wave function describing your atom, and then the wave function collapses in the course of measurement, resulting in some of the outcome probabilistically. And there is no cause how you choose these things. In the case of many worlds, this wave function describes an ensemble of universes, and in different members of the ensemble in different universes, you get all possible outcomes of your measurement.
In quantum mechanics or quantum physics, there are different interpretations of the data from experiments, ways of trying to understand what is and isn't happening in these experiments. The most popular approaches to this question, they say that these events in the quantum world are random and uncaused, or at least they're indeterministic. But these aren't the only approaches, and physicists, they're divided on which interpretation is correct. The late atheistic cosmologist Victor Stenger wrote, "Other viable interpretations of quantum mechanics remain, with no consensus on which, if any, is the correct one. Hence, we have to remain open to the possibility that causes may someday be found for such phenomena." The next academic being interviewed takes aim at William Lane Craig's interpretations of quantum mechanics and how it affects the Kalam cosmological argument.
In defense of the argument's first premise, Craig makes use of de Broglie-Bohm theory, also known as pilot wave theory. And in defense of the argument's second premise, Craig makes use of neo-Lorentzianism. Now, at least amongst physicists, both de Broglie-Bohm theory and neo-Lorentzianism are considered to be fringe and disreputable. Therefore, although Craig might seem to be simply appealing to common sense or to mainstream science, Craig is actually appealing to theories that do not enjoy wide philosophical or scientific support.
Okay, so Linford is critiquing Craig's use of the de Broglie-Bohm interpretation of quantum mechanics and neo-Lorentzian interpretations of relativity theory. I talked about Craig's use of Lorentz in part 1 of my review, so let's focus on the de Broglie-Bohm interpretation of quantum mechanics. This view says roughly that there are classical causes in quantum mechanics. It's not indeterministic. It may seem to be random, but there are causes that we can't detect. They're these hidden variables. So William Lane Craig prefers this view, and it's true that it is far from the majority view. But this part of the documentary is tricky, because it first shows the abstract for a 2016 survey of 149 physicists when it talks about which interpretations of quantum mechanics are popular. But then it shows the answers from a different 2013 survey that only had 33 participants. And when you look at the larger 2016 data, you find something interesting. There's still a strong plurality that favors the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, but But you still see 2% of people favoring Craig's approach. That would include classical causation, not the 0% in the slide from the video. But what's more interesting is that only 6% of physicists favor the many worlds approach to quantum mechanics that interprets experiments as showing what we see as randomness merely being part of different parallel worlds. Now, I wonder if this guest in the documentary, Daniel Linford, would say that the many worlds interpretation is fringe or disreputable, especially when it's presented as a plausible interpretation within the documentary.
Potentially to the role of causality in the many worlds interpretation, or the Everett interpretation. My own preferred approach to understanding many worlds has it that causality is a process that goes on within each individual world, but not outside or between them.
In the case of many worlds, this wave function describes an ensemble of universes. And in different members of the ensemble in different universes, you get all possible outcomes of your measurement.
Ultimately, this is just an appeal to popularity against Craig. It doesn't really work with something as speculative as quantum mechanics. The atheistic physicist Sean Carroll wrote a blog post about this survey, and he called it the most embarrassing graph in modern physics. Carroll says that it's embarrassing because physicists, they still aren't in agreement about fundamental elements of the interpretation of quantum mechanics. Now, it's true, there's a strong plurality behind the Copenhagen interpretation. But one reason for that is because this interpretation, it's really loosely defined. So you can support almost any version of it you want without being committed to especially controversial views. So here's what Sean Carroll writes. He says, "I'll go out on a limb to suggest that the results of this poll should be very embarrassing to physicists. Not, I hasten to add, because Copenhagen came in first, although that's also a perspective I might want to defend. I think Copenhagen is completely ill-defined and shouldn't be the favorite anything of any thoughtful person." Finally, as I said earlier, you can formulate a first cause argument or kalam argument without being committed to a particular view of relativity theory or quantum mechanics. So this objection doesn't refute the kalam argument. There is not some kind of consensus in quantum mechanics about how we are to interpret the events that are involved. That's still trying to be figured out. But regardless, if you move from that, nothing that's found in there disproves basic principles like something cannot come from nothing, or whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence.
I think one of the basic lessons you can learn from an advanced science of any sort is that common sense and intuition only takes you so far, and beyond a certain point, you really can't trust it. Russell once made the argument that since physics is really a systematization of our common sense approach to the world, his argument was, well, if common sense is true, then physics is true, and if physics is true, then common sense is false. Therefore, common sense is false.
It's true that physics does refute some common sense notions we have about reality. Like when we see clocks running slower with relativity theory, or particles acting in strange ways in quantum physics. But science also depends on elements of common sense. For example, it's common sense that the laws of physics that were true yesterday will be true today, and they're going to be true tomorrow. This is what allows scientists to replicate experiments and to keep them constant and to update their findings. But there's no scientific experiment that shows the laws of physics are uniform in this way. It's an intuition we have prior to doing science. Likewise, there's other basic metaphysical intuitions about the world we use to interpret scientific findings. And one of those is that things do not begin to exist without some kind of cause. If that was a legitimate solution to phenomena we saw in the universe, that, well, things can begin to exist without a cause, things can happen without a cause, there would be no way for scientists to rule that out for unexplained phenomena, for example. So it's not included because we have this basic intuition prior to doing science about how reality works. So true, science does show some common sense beliefs about the world are false, or at least they're incomplete, but it doesn't disprove basic metaphysical intuitions that we have about reality.
If something could come from nothing, then why doesn't this happen all the time? Why don't tigers just appear in our living room?
In quantum mechanics, many things are possible that are not possible in classical physics. And indeed, you can have in principle, you can have very strange things happening, like objects coming out of thin air. A lump of matter, in principle, it can turn into a tiger. And quantum mechanics will not tell you that this is absolutely impossible, but if you try to calculate the probability of this happening, it will be pretty low. If you think of the quantum creation of the universe, it is a tiny microscopic universe, right, that has to pop out of nothing. If you calculate the probability of this happening, I should say that conceptually this probability, interpreting this probability is a little difficult, but still, if you do the calculation, you find that it is far more probable than having a tiger materialize in front of you.
The argument that something can't come from nothing, or perhaps it'd be better to say something won't ever come into existence following nothing, isn't really confirmed by our everyday experience, because in our everyday experience we don't ever experience a nothing and check it to see whether something can or can't come from it. So there's no argument at all, I think, on the basis of what we've observed in everyday life at all, to think that something can't come from nothing.
First, notice that Vilenkin makes the claim that some things are impossible under classical physics. But how does he know this? If you say certain kinds of things cannot be causeless, like everyday objects that are in the world that are governed by classical physics, then you are affirming a causal principle and a basic intuition that is shared by the kalam argument. If we can know that, then advanced physics has not destroyed the value of common sense. As for the idea that, in principle, a lump of matter can turn into a tiger or things can appear out of thin air, this is going beyond science into philosophy. If by in principle, Vilenkin just means it's not logically contradictory for these things to happen, well, then he's ignoring all the other kinds of impossibility, like metaphysical impossibility we talked about in part 1 of my review. Just because it isn't logically impossible for a mouse to give birth to an elephant, that doesn't mean there is a possible world where this could really happen. It might be metaphysically impossible, given the nature of living things and their identity through time, similar to the metaphysical impossibility of something causing itself to exist. Finally, I'm glad Vilenkin acknowledges it is controversial to assign probability to something like the origin of the universe from nothing. That's because probability involves measuring relative interactions between existing things. Saying you can apply probability to the beginning of the universe from nothing is sort of like dividing by zero. What you're talking about is it's undefined, so we can't give any kind of probability for it, be it low or high. As for Arif Ahmed's argument, it's true, we don't observe absolute nothing and then check on it to make sure it stays nothing. But we also don't observe macroscopic objects like tigers or Toyotas coming into existence out of thin air. And this seems to make the situation worse for his objection, not better. We correctly assume thin air has no causal power to bring things like tigers into existence. From there, our ordinary everyday experience confirms that things can only come into existence if correct conditions are met. But absolute nothingness certainly lacks causal power or conditions of any kind to bring things into existence. So what we observe about thin air and what we infer about causal conditions from it would apply even more so in the case of absolute nothing. Now, in response, some people may say that in a state of absolute nothing, there are no laws of causation to prevent something from popping into existence. But I don't think it makes sense to talk about a state of nothingness. A state implies something. Instead, absolute nothing is another way of talking about universal negation, the complete absence of anything. And I also reject the view that laws of nature cause anything to happen. Laws of nature are just descriptions of things that happen in the universe. The descriptions don't have any causal power themselves. That causal power lies in substances or concrete things that act in accord with their nature, and the laws of physics just describe the predictable nature of these things. Now, what makes them predictable actually provides another piece of evidence for God being the ultimate designer of the universe, though that would be a subject for another video.
It isn't just quantum mechanics that divides thinkers about the nature of causality. Philosophers are equally unsure of its merits.
So causation is a classic philosophical topic in the sense that there's no agreement about it at all, and there hasn't been ever.
There's lots of schools of thought about what causality is. At the one extreme, we've got a view like that of Russell, which you might call the eliminativist theory of causation, according to which really there isn't any such thing as causality. Russell said if you look at the physics, certainly the physics of his day, and I think it's plausible to say about physics today as well, it consists of equations, for instance differential equations, and these relate states of a system at various times or at the same time, but they don't mention causal relations at all. And Russell's view was that the more developed a science is, the less appeal there is to causality in it. At the other extreme, or at least some way towards the other extreme, you've got views like the counterfactual theory, which says that A causes B means that if A hadn't happened, then B wouldn't have happened. But there are complications with trying to work out what exactly what's called the counterfactual, is supposed to mean, and that might in turn appeal to causality. So it may not even be a full account of causality at all. Or even further along the line, you might have a full-blown sufficiency account of causation, according to which A causes B means that A somehow makes or forces B to happen. And in between these extremes, there are all kinds of different theories. So it's a bit implausible if you assume, as the kalam argument does, that whatever begins to exist must have a cause on the basis of our intuitive conception of what causality is. The intuitive conception of causality is vague and it covers a whole range of different things, and you really have to be clear about which one you mean more precisely before that argument can be given any force.
The problem with this argument is that you can affirm a basic principle of reality without having an entirely worked out theory behind the principle. For example, nearly everyone agrees other minds exist beside our own, and that there are mental states that aren't identical to brain states. This is true even among philosophers where there is a wide variety of disagreement about theories of mind, or what is called the philosophy of mind. But in spite of this disagreement about that we don't have a complete theory of mind, you're still perfectly rational to affirm basic intuitions about reality related to our minds, like that I have one, you have one. It has properties that are different from the properties of my brain, and so on. So from that, we can say the same thing about causation. Right? So there are philosophers who disagree with William Lane Craig on things like divine causation or other kinds of causation in physics, but would agree with him that there are fundamental causal principles, like whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. For example, the late atheistic philosopher Quentin Smith disagreed a lot with William Lane Craig in their book Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology. But he says that any skepticism about causation among philosophers, it didn't prevent Smith from saying things about how self-causation is impossible. He writes, "No individual can bring about its own existence because no individual can bring about anything unless it already exists." End quote. And as we'll see, this thinking applies to the universe as well. The universe is something that would need a cause for its existence, and it cannot be its own cause.
The universe had a beginning. It's hard to see how it could have a cause. After all, we tend to think of causes happening before their effects. But if time began with the universe, then there was no before. So how could God have caused it?
And I frankly just don't understand why people think that causality is a temporal relationship. For example, philosophers talk all the time about cases of simultaneous causation, where the cause and effect occur at the same moment of time. Immanuel Kant gave the example of a heavy ball resting on a pillow, causing a depression in the pillow. Now, the ball and the pillow could have existed from eternity past.
This seems like the admission of something that's existed for a past eternity. So it may be that Craig, by using this example, is allowing, and he may not consistently be able to allow, that something's existed for a past eternity.
Ahmed's objection was that this isn't a good example of simultaneous causation because it relies on the pillow and the ball existing for all eternity, and Craig says that's not possible. In that case, we can just alter the example. In fact, something I previously wrote on simultaneous causation appeared in one of William Lane Craig's questions of the week that are posted on his website. In it, a reader asked Craig the following: "I am, however, struggling with an analogy that was given by Trent Horn. and I was hoping that you could address it. Horn says that, quote, the cause of an effect does not always have to occur before an effect. And he supports this with Kant, quote, the greater part of operating causes in nature are simultaneous with their effects. If the cause had but a moment before ceased to be, the effect could not have arisen. Horn then uses the analogy of a brick going through the window. He writes, in this case, it is clear that the brick is thrown before the window breaks, and the window doesn't break before the brick hits it. But notice that there is a brief overlap where the cause, the brick flying through the air, is simultaneous with the effect, the window breaking. If the brick disappeared even a microsecond before it touched the window, then the effect would never happen. So there has to be a moment where the cause and effect happen at the same time, end quote. The reader then asks, in this example, wouldn't the cause not be the brick itself, but the action of throwing the brick, thus making the cause and effect not simultaneous events? And here's William Lane Craig's response to the reader. He writes, I completely agree with Horn's Kantian claim that, quote, the cause of an effect does not always have to occur before an effect, end quote. Indeed, how could the cause and its effect not be simultaneous? As Horn says, if the brick disappeared even a microsecond before it touched the window, then the effect would never happen, end quote. Craig says, I'd love to have the critics of simultaneous causation explain to us how a causal influence can leap across such a temporal gap to produce an effect at a later time. In a causal chain, the last link in the chain seemingly has to be simultaneous with the effect, or the effect would not occur. So, writing in this example, the reader says, in this example, wouldn't the cause not be the brick itself, but the action of throwing the brick, thus making the cause and effect not simultaneous? Craig replies to that by saying, no, the cause of the window's breaking is the bricks hitting the window. You're responsible for throwing the brick that hit the window, so you might be criminally liable for breaking the window. You are the agent cause who initiated the causal chain, resulting in the window's breaking. Your throwing the brick is the remote cause of the window's breaking, but the proximate cause is the bricks hitting the window. So we see here not only is simultaneous causation not problematic, it seems like we can't have a comprehensive theory of causation without some kind of simultaneous causation. And if that's the case, then we can apply simultaneous causation to the universe as a whole, saying that the effect of the universe coming into existence is simultaneous with God causing it to come into existence at the first moment of time.
In physics literature, there is no such thing as simultaneous causation. So the notion of causality in physics always has a chronological nature, that basically the cause should precede the effect. And in this particular example of the ball and the pillow, if you just look at things as they are at one instant, then you cannot really make any statement about causality. But if you look at the history of what preceded what, basically you put a ball somewhere, and then its effect propagates with the speed of sound through the medium, and the pillow basically accordingly reacts to that.
It's quite unclear what it means to say that one thing causes another if you lose the sort of context of space, time, and the laws of nature. I mean, one very obvious reason for this is that many accounts of causation either explicitly or implicitly make reference to the laws of nature. Many of them also make reference to time. For instance, Hume's own definition of causation was that the cause must precede the effect in time and must be next to it in space, or there must be a chain of adjoining events in space. So we really can't make any sense of what it means for something to be a cause of another thing without time or space, any more than we can make sense of what it means for something to have a colour or to have a shape or a size outside of notions like time and space.
First, we can have concepts of things apart from space. For example, we can have the concept of triangularity or three-sidedness without needing to picture any particular triangle. Since the concept of triangularity, it encompasses all three different kinds of triangles. You know, there's isosceles, right angle. It encompasses all of them. Likewise, the concept of causality, we can have that and we can apply it to the universe, even if it's different from our everyday experience of causality. Second, it seems like there's a double standard here in the documentary. When a causal claim helps William Lane Craig, like the claim that uncaused beginnings are impossible, the experts say we should be really skeptical. We can't know that's true. We should be skeptical of it. But if a causal claim hurts William Lane Craig's argument, like the claim that simultaneous causation is impossible, suddenly we're not skeptical. We know that that's true, so Craig's argument fails. So it seems like a double standard. And third, this part of the documentary, it seems to contradict an earlier part that said that causation isn't really even an important part of physics.
Russell said if you look at the physics, certainly the physics of his day, and I think it's plausible to say about physics today as well, it consists of equations, for instance, differential equations, and these relate states of a system at various times or at the same time, but they don't mention causal relations at all.
If these philosophers and scientists were consistent, they'd be aware that there can be many types of causes. Against Hume's claim that causes must be spatially located to something, physicists study what Einstein once called spooky action at a distance, or two particles affecting each other without being spatially connected. Other physicists have explored things like retro or backward causation. So surely it isn't too far removed for a cause and effect to be simultaneous rather than being separated by a before and after temporal interval.
The notion of causality doesn't have the kind of purity of a notion, let's say, like number or logical notions, which do make this sort of extra-spatial, extra-temporal sense. And for that reason, to posit a cause of the universe that's outside of space and time, as the Kalam argument must, if it's going to prove anything like the divinity that people like Craig would want it to prove, seems to me stretching the notion of causality far beyond any of its uses that we can actually comprehend.
I mean, some concepts only make sense when applied within the universe or within some part of the universe. I mean, if you ask how much something costs, some table or some chair, then that makes perfect sense and there's a good answer. If you ask how much the universe costs, that doesn't really make sense because you can't step outside the universe to buy it. It could be very similar with cause and effect. Cause and effect is something that operates inside the universe, so it just doesn't make sense to step outside the universe and ask what causes it. Cause and effect is something that happens within the universe, not to it.
This is basically saying the Kalam argument commits the fallacy of composition, that what is true of parts is not necessarily true of the whole. Just because every cell in my body is invisible to the naked eye, it doesn't mean my entire body is invisible to the naked eye. But sometimes what is true of parts is true of the whole. If every brick in a wall is red, the whole wall will be red. So as a result, the burden is really on the critic who says causality cannot be applied to the entire universe. I mean, consider the law of non-contradiction. If it's true every part of the universe cannot exist and not exist at the same time, this seems to apply to the universe as a whole. It can't exist and not exist at the same time. So if we can apply laws of logic to the entire universe, why not laws of causality as well?
We've seen that many cosmologists favor a bouncing cosmology, which may be eternal into the past. Others favor a universe that had a beginning from a spontaneous fluctuation. Another class of models suggests that solutions to Einstein's equations that allow time travel into the past, known as closed time-like curves, could enable the universe to create itself.
This is clearly impossible, for in order to create itself, the universe would have to already exist. It would have to exist before it existed, which is a self-contradiction.
It may be inconsistent for Craig to say that, on the one hand, causes do not have to precede their effects in time, but then on the other hand, dismissing the idea of a self-created universe on the basis that a self-created universe would have to precede itself in time.
Craig isn't being inconsistent. Craig claims that causes don't always have to precede their effects in time. For example, the effect of the universe coming into existence could be simultaneous with God's timeless decree to bring the universe into existence. Now, I know Craig has kind of an odd view of God and time, but let me just set that aside right now. God causing the universe to be is simultaneous with the universe coming to be. But Craig is also claiming in the other clip that nothing can cause itself, because in order to have causal power, a thing must exist. So nothing can cause its own existence, because existence is logically rather than temporally prior to the effects like having causal power. So in reply to Ahmed, there is a difference between saying a cause and effect are distinct, but they are simultaneous, the cause and effect are different, and saying cause and effect are simultaneous because the cause is the effect, or the cause and effect are the same thing. That would be a kind of self-causation Craig says is impossible. So when Craig says a self-caused universe is impossible because it would have to precede itself, he's probably talking about logical priority in explanation, rather than preceding oneself in time. For example, you couldn't say the effect of the universe coming into existence from nothing is simply the cause of the universe coming into existence from nothing, because this would violate the law of non-contradiction. It would require the universe to both exist, because it would be exercising causal power, and for it to not exist, because it would be coming into existence at the same time. This is very different from God simultaneously causing the universe to come into existence. This is where the cause and effect, they're not the same in the logical sense, even though they are the same in the temporal sense, that they occur at the same moment of time. But the cause and effect are distinct. So here, simultaneous causation makes sense, but you can't just use simultaneous causation to try to prove self-causation, where cause and effect are just the same thing, because that would be contradictory.
A self-creating universe may appear to be a contradiction if you imagine a linear direction of time, because if you have some cause that leads to our universe, then that cause should precede the effect. But if you have a circular time, then there is really no notion of cause and effect, and because of that, there is no contradiction, because basically all you have is a consistency condition between what happens at one era and what happens at the prior era or future era, because they all just lead to each other. And as long as those consistencies hold, there is no contradiction.
You might have the whole closed time-like curve, and at that level, causality is kind of not an appropriate concept. But if you focus on individual segments of the curve, you might have unidirectional cause and effect just restricted to that particular segment. And so we're right to think in terms of causality at the local level. When we zoom out, causality as such ceases to apply, but we can still do physics. The fact that our intuitive understanding of cause and effect ceases to apply at the global level, that doesn't stop us writing down equations that would describe that system.
Circular causation brings its own philosophical and scientific problems with it. Consider the question, why are there 3 Eskimos in New York City? Imagine if I say, well, number 3 followed number 2 followed number 1, then number 1 followed number 3. This kind of circular definition still doesn't answer the question of why they're there. And I think we can apply something similar to a universe that has a circular timeline. From a scientific perspective, one problem with universes based on closed time-like curves, or CTCs, is that there could be paradoxes that arise if some elements of a timeline continue over into the next cycle. That's why in a paper on this subject, 2 prominent researchers on this topic say, the region of CTCs should be in a pure vacuum state, containing no real particles or Hawking radiation and no bubbles. Stephen Hawking even wrote, it seems that there is a chronology protection agency which prevents the appearance of closed time-like curves, and so makes the universe safe for historians. Now, I need to pause, and I wonder if Hawking got this idea of the chronology protection agency from Marvel's Time Variance Authority, the TVA. It's actually long before the Loki series. You can go back to a 1986 edition of Thor where the TVA is. But in any case, I'm getting ahead of myself. My point is there's a lot of problems in literature on circular causation, so this is really not something that can be used to refute the causal premise of the kalam, which is that whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence, and it becomes contradictory if a thing causes its own existence.
In order to assert the universe must have been created by an agent with free will, Craig uses an argument from the medieval philosopher Al-Ghazali, which asserts the universe must have arisen spontaneously, and the only example of spontaneous action is that of a free agent, something we supposedly know from our everyday experience of the world.
I mean, I think it's a pretty good argument. It's just that the premises we no longer tend to accept. The kind of modern conception of the world, the standard view of quantum physics is that it's not deterministic after all, that most interpretations of quantum mechanics have some indeterminism in them. And the most popular approach to understanding free action tends to be compatibilist. It sees free action as compatible with the laws of physics, indeed enabled by the action of the laws of physics. So Al-Ghazali's argument was pretty good, given the assumptions he was making. It's just that I don't think we now have any reason to accept those assumptions.
If you're in the game of appealing to everyday observations, then there's all kinds of things you can say that would be unhelpful to the Kalam argument. For instance, we observe that every event has been preceded by another event, but clearly the Kalam argument can't allow for that. We observe that everything that comes into existence has a material cause, if it has a cause at all, but again, the Kalam argument can't allow for that. We observe that all agency, for instance, all intelligent agency, is material. But again, the Kalam argument can't allow for such things. So everyday experience furnishes all kinds of generalizations that are inconsistent with the conclusion of the Kalam argument. And it's just arbitrary to choose the generalizations that you like from everyday experience and ignore the ones that don't fit with your conclusion.
The problem with Ahmed's objection is that as you make the causal principle narrower and narrower, you commit the fallacy of hasty or accidental generalization. For example, it doesn't follow that all intelligent causes we observe, they're not just material, they're also human. So therefore, there are no non-human intelligent causes in the universe. I mean, there could be aliens or angels or other intelligent beings. So just because there are some generalizations that are made in haste so they can't be applied universally, it doesn't follow that there aren't true generalizations we can make that can be applied universally, like that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Ahmed's objection seems to be that the Kalam defender is just picking observations to generalize that he wants to be general or universal. But defenders of the Kalam argument, like Craig, offer independent reasons for believing in premise one of the argument. Finally, if the Kalam argument works and shows the universe has a finite past, we can know some of these other generalizations are false. So the Kalam argument shows every event is not preceded by another event. There's a first event. And everything cannot have a material cause, because if it did, this would entail an impossible regress of material causes, since material causes act and exist within space and time. Now, when it comes to the argument for the personal nature of the cause of the universe, in this argument, Craig is saying that if the cause is not personal, then all of the conditions necessary for the cause to actualize the effect, they would have been present for all eternity. So the effect should be as infinitely old as the cause. Now, there are other arguments to show the cause of the universe is personal in nature, but I don't think that this objection overcomes this particular argument, because all it's saying is, well, that's true, except now we know there are some systems that don't deterministically create an effect when all the conditions are present, like quantum mechanics. Sometimes it's probabilistic. It's not always guaranteed to happen. But here, someone like William Lane Craig could just say, even if there is a probabilistic cause, that it'll happen given a certain percentage or ratio of probability, at some point in the infinite past, the probability, if it's greater than zero, would have been actualized. It would have obtained. And if that happened in an infinite past, you would have gotten the same result, an eternal effect. So Craig would argue that only an agent can freely choose to act or not act. An agent like God, in this case, can explain why there is an effect of a finite universe that is ultimately grounded in God's timeless decree to create a finite universe. So it's not like God was waiting around for all eternity, deciding what to do or what not to do. God is timeless, and he acts in one moment. And in his timeless will, he acts and wills for there to be a finite rather than an infinite universe. And that concludes my review of Skydivephil's documentary. Thank you guys so much for watching. I know there's a lot more that can be said back and forth in these arguments. The Kalam argument is very complicated. It's deceptively simple, but it's very complicated. So next week, I'm going to be sharing an interview with Alex Malpass, a philosopher who was featured in the documentary, and we'll have more of a back and forth on some of these objections. So definitely stay tuned for that. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope that you have a very blessed day. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you want to help us produce more great content like this, be sure to click subscribe and go to TrentHornPodcast.com to become a premium subscriber. You'll help us create more videos like this and get access to bonus content and sneak peeks of our upcoming projects.